Good afternoon, Frank.
Hello, Professor.
I think that it would be difficult to talk about globalization this week without saying something about the process that's beginning to get underway in Rome.
Yes, yes.
The church is an amazingly interesting institution, actually, because it's been around for so long and is generally thought of in the world today as being not quite the most modern institution in the world. But in fact, in some ways, it's been ahead of its time for a long while, because after all, it's a global institution with a central government. What other global institution do we have with a central government? And it's been an international institution, if not entirely global, for a long time, and the only one for a long time that didn't depend upon heredity for succession.
Well, at least not since the 700s when they enforced the celibacy ban. Yes, yes.
But it's a long time.
Yes, it has. It is a long time. Yes.
There's also something I mean, it reminds me of Plato's Republic, the way the successors are chosen by this conclave of the superior people who are kept separate from the populace and made to be celibate and therefore not have children themselves that could corrupt their political values.
Well, I find it very interesting because the up until Tuesday, the American Cardinals were holding a daily news conference for the Italian and Vatican press, just ruminating publicly about what the next leader should be focusing on and perhaps directions for the future for the church. And some of the comments that were coming out were actually quite striking. And that was clamped down on by the authorities.
Just yesterday, I believe.
Just yesterday. And
well, now, I wonder whether it was clamped down on by the authorities. I mean, who are the authorities?
Well, the authorities perhaps might have been the Curia, which was in fact one of the main attack points of the American Cardinals, talking about reformation of said Curia.
Well, they certainly got them to agree to keep their ideas private for the time being.
Yes.
But it's interesting, though, that there is, I mean, in every political organization that has to choose leaders, there is a tug of war between popular opinion and what could we call it, the political possibilities. And between the short-term prospects that public opinion have in mind and the long-term prospects that people who are closer to the center have in mind.
Well, it's interesting to me because it's almost a question of basic human dynamics. You have 116 people, I believe it is, who are eligible to vote. And a number of them are already, to use the phrase indelicately, damaged goods for one reason or another. The former Cardinal of Los Angeles, Roger Mahoney, has been tainted with the sexual scandal because he apparently didn't act when he should have acted, etc. And there are a few more like that that are also tainted. So you can knock them off. There are also some that are bordering on the 80-year-old mandatory retirement age, which presumably, given what's been going on for the last, I don't know, 15 years as John Paul was aging and then Benedict XVI was aging, presumably the focus would be on somebody a little bit younger. So in my mind, they would be stricken as well. And then you have people who are perhaps very, very, very Opus Dei-like conservative, all right, who hopefully would be then also excluded from consideration. And then you have people on the other wing who are very, very, very liberal, advocating priests being able to marry, advocating complete approval of abortion, etc., etc. So they would be excluded. So now you're talking about, I'm just picking a number out of thin air, you might be talking about a group of 40-ish or so different people. Now, within that group, I think by necessity, simply the way the demographics work, you're going to have Americans, you're going to have Canadians, you're going to have Asians, and you're going to have Africans. And there's a very, very good chance, as we discussed the last time, I think just simply when you look at the numbers, that if I was a betting person, there will be a non-Italian pope, and he may very well be a pope from one of those areas that we've never seen before.
Well, to some extent, it depends on whether the Italian cardinals will vote for a non-Italian or for an Italian, and whether the Europeans will vote for a non-European, since they have all the votes.
It will.
But it's interesting that they do have this problem of I think there's only 2 African cardinals and something in the teens of Latin American and a few from other parts of the world.
There are remarkably few Asian cardinals.
Yeah, yeah. So there is, the church has a really serious problem that is institutional, of how to manage its next generation in a way that will keep up with social change. And another thing that's got a lot of attention in the media in the last few days is the fact that there's been a growing minority of members of the church since 1963 who've wanted to go back to the Latin Mass. And Pope Benedict apparently supported them.
Yeah, he threw them a couple of bones.
And so there is, therefore, in what we might call popular opinion in the church, division between the evangelicals and the conservatives. And after all, the church is not in the same way that Islam is totally historically oriented, because it is looking towards the future. If you are a practicing Catholic, then you're thinking about what happens in the future. Mm-hmm. However, its legitimacy is based on the past, especially the legitimacy of the church itself. And so it's going to be very difficult for them to manage this problem of the acceleration of change in the modern world.
But yet, excuse me, this could be an example of one of those instances where usually the institutions are being surpassed by change on the ground. This could be an opportunity for the institution to change itself and at least become concurrent with what's changing on the ground. It could be.
Well, I've always been interested in the way that architecture shapes the way we interact with each other in our daily lives. And since in the last generation buildings have been knocked down and rebuilt at an accelerating rate, that doesn't keep us, hold us to social forms that we got used to 50 years ago so much now as it used to. But in the case of the church depends upon so many buildings that are hundreds of years old, or at least, I mean, varies enormously from one part of the world to another. It's very difficult for the church to reorganize the practice of Christianity in the buildings that it has to work in. Or the big tendency in the modern world is to reorganize the way you do things. Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask you a question on that. Not to completely change the subject, but you have just returned from a place that some 65 years ago was razed to the ground. That was essentially an architectural nirvana insofar as being able to rebuild. And then some 20 years ago, when the Iron Curtain fell, the most valuable part of the center of Berlin was suddenly made available for architectural rebirth. And then subsequent to that, when the German federal government moved from Bonn to Germany, there was yet another burst of architectural activity. Maybe could you comment a little bit about how you saw the architectural changes perhaps affecting the institutions as you just referred to?
Well, actually, the first thing I noticed in Berlin, and it's the first time I'd walked the streets of Berlin, was that I recognized the architecture as a German city architecture from before the war.
Really?
Yes.
And now, was this done in a modernist motif for pre-war, or were they actually old buildings from pre-war?
I think that in the same way that London suffered enormous bombing in the war, but nevertheless there's a lot of architecture there that survived from before the war. And I think the same is true of Berlin. I mean, they told me where Hitler's bunker had been, and the fact that there's no trace of it at the moment, well, I didn't actually go and check on that. And there are new buildings, but there is a limit on the height of buildings in Berlin, which is uncommon in modern cities now. Most cities have terminated any limits they had on the height of buildings, but Berlin still has these limits. And Berlin is rather like the rest of Germany in that it doesn't have, it's not so strongly centralized as France is. In France, Paris is the center of the whole country, and and Paris has a center. Germany is very regionally distributed in terms of German national values, and Berlin is a number of different neighborhoods without a center that stands out as being so much more important than the rest of the capital. This is one of the things that I found very interesting about it.
Do you think, how much of that do you think is due to the fact that it was a divided city for 40 or 50 years?
Well, I must say that it's very interesting that it should have been able to come together as one city again so easily after being separated into two cities for what was it, 30 odd years, well, more than that, 40 years. But and that they've maintained a piece of wall as a memorial to the original wall, but essentially it's now entirely one city. I mean, the center that in which I was giving a talk there was in fact a successor institution to the East German Academy of Sciences, but it was also the home in Berlin to a national project which is supported by a number of different German universities in different parts of the country. So I was sitting in a building which was a very nice pre-war building, a beautiful villa, which had been a part of the East German Academy of Sciences for 40 years, and was part of a pan-German academic project. So I think that shows very well that they've really been very good at bringing things together again. And apparently, I mean, there's a lot of people who didn't do so well from East Germany and East Berlin after the reunification of Germany and of Berlin, but very well and adapted very well.
Well, I'm just thinking as you're speaking, of course, Angela Merkel is from the Dresden area.
Yeah.
She's an Easterner, and she's the chancellor. I mean, you're right. It was an amazingly fast integration.
Yeah. No, it's impressive. And I think, in fact, there is something different about German identity. And we tend to think in terms of national identity as though it's as though French identity is the same order of phenomena as German identity or British identity. But I think nationalism has really a different meaning in each European setting, let alone in the rest of the world. The Germans, I think the German identity was built from the ground up, whereas French identity was certainly imposed from the top down in the 18th century.
Let me, if I may, ask a question. Berlin, of course, is home to many hundreds of thousands of guest workers. Many Turks, many Kurds. And we often talk about those types of communities in Western urban areas in particular, maintaining their own identities and their own cultural institutions. How did you find any of that? Did you notice any?
I heard a lot about it. I didn't actually experience anything directly, but I've come across people saying that you can never become a German. You might get citizenship, but you won't become a German.
Okay.
However, I was interested to see that if I wanted to eat German food, I had to look for a German restaurant, whereas I could find Thai restaurants, Turkish restaurants, all sorts of other restaurants all over the place.
Really?
Yeah.
Really? Is it an extraordinarily international city? Did you hear many languages on the streets?
I didn't hear so many. I did hear other languages on the street. The academic institution that I was a guest of everybody I met there was from a different part of Europe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it certainly is the center of Europe.
Right, right.
In more ways than one.
One final question about Berlin. Did you notice any retention at all of any Allied military presence there at all, or hear of any?
No, I didn't.
You didn't. All right. So the Army of the Rhine and the American military forces are, if they're there, they're well out of view.
Certainly in Berlin, yes.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Now, was there any? You were there actually at the time that the German Pope resigned. Was there any discussion about that?
No, there wasn't. Well, I got there, a week or so after he resigned. Mm-hmm. But nobody seemed particularly interested in it. But that may just be the sort of people that I mix with, not
okay,
not the German Catholics in general.
Very interesting. Okay.
But anyway, it was interesting to be in a European city, which was very international, where life seemed to be very relaxed, and yet it's certainly one of these international nodes where everybody in one city is related to people or knows what's going on in a lot of other cities. Mm-hmm. I think it can be taken as an indication of the fact that I would always have argued for anyway, that globalization is not producing homogeneity.
No, not at all. Not at all. Well, that very interesting, Professor. I look forward to hearing more about the Berlin trip in the future. But now you gave a talk on the Belush, if I understand, correct?
Yes, and I finished up reinterpreting the history of Iranian civilization.
Oh, my.
In order to make sense of the position of the Baluch in world history.
Oh, all right.
Now, I write it up quickly in order to patent it.
You should. Well, I'd be interested in reading it. All right, well, thank you very much for your time.
Okay.
See you next week.
Bye.
All right, bye.